think the West is not going to be responsible for stopping China. It's going to be the United States and its allies in Asia. And that would include Russia, in my opinion. But I don't think the West, if you're talking about the West Europeans or you're talking about NATO, are going to have much of a role at all in containing China. I think when you start thinking about what the balancing coalition that will look like that contains China, it will include countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, India, and I would argue Russia as well. But the Europeans are not going to play a role in that game, in large part because Europe is far away from China. And Europe has hardly any power projection capability, any military capability that it can move to Asia to help do the job. Well, to start with, don't believe that there's any such thing as a global community, right? I believe that the world is comprised of states, nation states, and those states pursue their own interests. And my view is that if China continues to grow economically, it will become a peer competitor of the United States, or it will have the potential to become a peer competitor of the United States. And the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. And that's why I believe the United States will go to great lengths to try to contain China. And at the same time, China will try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. I think the Chinese would be foolish not to try and dominate Asia, not to try to push the Americans out of Asia. And have their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. So I believe that over time, you're going to have a clash. I don't know whether you'll have a war, but you'll have a serious security competition between China on one hand and the United States on the other. And those will be the two most powerful states on the planet. So that competition will define international politics. In that world, Europe is not going to matter anywhere near as much as it has in the past, because European countries are basically shrinking in size. Germany is depopulating. Even Russia is depopulating. So if you look at the balance of power over time between Russia and the United States, Germany and the United States, that balance is going to shift more and more in favor of the United States. So Europe is just not going to be that important a place in the future as it has been in the past. The real action, from an American point of view for certain, is in East Asia, and it revolves around the Chinese. Well, the Americans have foolishly pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese in recent years, and this is all a result of the Ukraine crisis. It's in America's interest to have good relations with the Russians. It's in Europe's interest to have good relations with the Russians. But from an American point of view, we need Russian help on Afghanistan. We need Russian help on Syria. We need Russian help on dealing with Iran. And we're going to need Russian help in dealing with China. So pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, as we have done, is a violation of basic geopolitical logic. And the Americans should be ashamed of themselves for doing this foolish thing. But my view is that with the passage of time, relations between Russia and a rising China will deteriorate. And the Americans will recognize the error of their ways, and relations between the Americans and the Russians will improve. You want to remember that the United States had terrible relations with the Soviet Union after it was created in 1917. Indeed, the United States did not recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. And even in the late 30s, had nothing good to say about the Soviet Union. But then, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union went to war against each other, the United States became a very close ally of the Soviet Union because they had this common adversary, which was Germany. I'm arguing that a similar situation will set in with regard to China and Russia. Eventually, Russia will see China as more of an adversary, in large part for geographical reasons. They share a border. And as a result, the Russians and the Americans will be on the same side. But it'll take some time. And that's regrettable, again, because the United States should have never pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, but it did. It's inevitable. I don't think that a war is inevitable. I think the potential for war is very great, and I think we're going to have to go to great lengths to make sure we avoid it, if at all possible. But I think a serious security competition is inevitable because again, as I said to you before, the Chinese will try to dominate Asia. And the Chinese will tell you behind closed doors that they want to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, then they want to push the Americans out beyond the second island chain. The Chinese do not like the Americans with their Navy and their Air Force going up and down their coastline. Just like the Americans wouldn't like it if the Chinese came into the Caribbean or into the Atlantic or into the Pacific and were going up and down America's coastline. So the Chinese will try to dominate East Asia, if not all of Asia. And the United States will go to great lengths to make sure that they don't do that. And how this plays itself out is very tricky. And it's very tricky, I would add, because when you look at the potential conflicts between the United States and China, or China and its neighbors, a number of those conflicts would take place in the ocean, in the water. And it's much easier to have a conflict in the water where not a lot of people would be killed than to have a big, massive war on the Asian continent or the European continent. You're too young to remember, but during the Cold War, we found it almost impossible when we ran war games in Europe to get a war started because nobody thought it was rational to start a war, whether you were playing the side of the Soviet Union or playing the side of NATO, because you had two giant armies that were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And there was a great fear that everybody would end up getting vaporized because you'd have a nuclear war. So therefore, it became very difficult to get a war started. But if you start talking about a conflict in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or over Taiwan, it's not going to be easy to get a war started over those areas, but you can see where it is possible to do so because it would not involve a big, massive land war with the threat of nuclear escalation.